Welcome to the Lorecast. I'm Dr. Craig Chalquist, looking at the stories by which we deeply live. Welcome to part 2 of a two-part episode, Stories for a Planetary Mythology. In the previous episode, which is episode 57 of the Lorecast, our podcast, I talked about the idea of creating a new cycle of stories that could function as a kind of planetary mythology to help us orient on who we are as a species, how the human family relates to the world, to the cosmos, and just in general help us find our bearings in an age of alienation and anxiety. I talked in that podcast about some of the elements I think belong in those kinds of stories, and in this podcast I want to talk a bit about how to hold those stories and what we might bring to them. So to start us out, it's important to realize that one of the most divisive things about religions, which have been by and large our big stories for millennia, is their emphasis on absolute belief, absolute truth. The problem, of course, is when your absolute beliefs and somebody else's are different. Because they are absolute, there is no room for building bridges, there is no room for agreeing to disagree. The other person is not only wrong, but their very existence is against what your religion teaches. So as long as our beliefs are absolute, conflict is inevitable. But conflict doesn't have to be an inevitable part of having a big story or a set of stories that help us understand our place in the world. So in my second dissertation, Restoring Our Lore, there's a term I use, post-belief. And I'm referring to how some of us find it natural and easy and worthwhile to be guided by our stories, including the spiritual ones, without having to insist that they are absolutely and literally true. I also pointed out in my dissertation that the highly emotional emphasis on absolute belief is what psychology would recognize as a defensive structure. It's a defense against anxiety, rootlessness, fear, and a number of other things. And in that study, I mentioned the philosopher Descartes, who was orphaned at an early age and lived in a time full of political and other kinds of conflict. And his psychological need for believing that whatever else was up for grabs, his thoughts were absolutely trustable. The fact that he could think, I think, therefore I am, was the one piece of certainty he could hold on to in an uncertain world, including after his daughter died. So when we come from a place of insisting not only on absolute belief, but that our absolute beliefs are true, then it's time to do an inquiry, if we want to be honest with ourselves, on what we're afraid of and how we're trying to ward it off. So if we're going to talk about a new mythology, a new set of stories to help us navigate life today, then we might consider abandoning the entire project of absolute belief and settling instead for inspiring stories. Now, it happens that there's some really great tools right at hand for doing this, and one of them is based on the fact that in all societies there have been groups of people who looked at their own mythologies, their own sacred stories, and instead of believing them literally as absolutely true or just dumping them and saying this is all made up, they chose the middle path and said these are wisdom stories. These are stories with valuable lessons about how we should be with each other, about what life is all about the voice of the earth and other things. So translating our lore, our mythologies, our tales, into workable fictions is one way we can do this and learn from our stories, past and present. Another is that we already have the beginnings of a kind of planetary mythology in what might at first glance be a very unlikely place, in the world of fiction, speculative fiction in particular. So when you think about it, one way of holding our sacred stories, our mythologies, is by thinking about them as fictions we believe in, whereas fiction that goes by that word, these are stories that we know aren't literally true, but that we still find valuable. We can probably all name movies or books that once we've finished with them, we felt uplifted, joyful. We had this brief glimpse of the possibility that maybe things would be all right, that maybe the world was a great place to live, that maybe human beings could do marvelous things. And that's a peak experience that we can get from stories that we know were invented. The folklorist Jack Zipes commented that our fantasy stories of today, so Lord of the Rings and all the many, many, many others that come along, that these are actually the fairy tales of today. I would extend this observation even farther, and I would say that speculative fiction is our mythology. The difference is we don't believe in it literally, even though it can give us ideas that we can build on and even go beyond. So the resemblance between smartphones and communicators in Star Trek isn't accidental. And I saw an amusing cartoon a few years back where Kirk and Spock were standing on a city street corner somewhere showing off their communicators, and some people of our day were saying, "Is that all they do?" Now, of course, the most immediate objection to using fiction as a sort of myth and sacred experience and orientation is, but we just make it up. Well, not necessarily. Long ago, Carl Jung said, God approaches man through symbols. I would say for our day that mystery approaches us through fiction. So speaking of Jung, if you've read Memories, Dreams, Reflections, or his black or red books, his black books are his journals, you know that he used imagination to talk to, quote, fictional characters, namely the images and the figures that rose from his unconscious. The psyche has an almost magical ability to take any material and form it into a character. That's what we see in our dreams, for instance. And we see that in fiction as well. And Jung found, by talking to these characters, that they had things to say that he did not know consciously. And some of these characters, probably the majority of them, were actually figures out of the world's mythologies. So at least psychologically, the gods are still alive. They look a little different these days, perhaps, but they're still alive. And they can tell us things through our stories that we don't recognize consciously, but then later understand are true. They speak in symbols and metaphors and sometimes riddles, and sometimes symptoms. I mentioned in my dissertation that there were a couple of surveys done in Scotland. The last one was 2014, I believe. And at a convention for fiction writers, some of the writers were asked, do you ever talk to your characters in imagination? And do you think they have some kind of agency, some kind of autonomy? And roughly 60% of the writers that were asked said yes, and I do. I've had my own experience of this with my Assembling Terrania cycle, with my first novel of hopeful science fiction, which is called Soul Mapper, and I'm working now on the second novel. It's going to be a trilogy. And I talk to the characters all the time, and they give me plot twists that I wouldn't have been able to make up consciously. They tell me things I didn't know about the world, about themselves, about myself. So, as Jung recognized, there's something about the psyche that is autonomous, that insists on speaking in its own voices. And it's up to the conscious mind to make space for that. So, just as the gods of old have inhabited the world's mythologies, the world's sacred stories, so those powers in different form inhabit our speculative fictions. And what those of us who talk to them are finding is that these powers aren't separate from the world. They may indeed exist beyond it, but they're intricately intertwined with our ecosystems, our possessions, the lands we live on, our neighborhoods, our cities. And so instead of telling literalized tales involving absolute belief in static entities, we can have flexible, perennially under construction tales, flexible tales that allow us to communicate with the powers inside and around us in a constantly creative conversation. Which leads us to another consideration here. When we try to make the stories and the God figures and all the rest of it not only absolute fact, absolute belief, but when we try to make them literal, we run into trouble. Because the deep psyche, the dream world, doesn't seem to like the literal very much. And in fact, we could look at this developmentally and trace literalism to early childhood. So for instance, if you're talking to a young child and you tell them, I'd like to get a bird's eye view of this situation, they might well ask you if you mean flying up above the houses to see what's going on. Because they naturally, in some ways, think literally, although they also think metaphorically and symbolically, which is the move that we want to make in order to understand the depths of our own storytelling. So taking things literally is what patriarchal religion tends to encourage in us, and even those of us who identify as atheists do it. Science itself is permeated with literalism. How often do you hear a scientist talking about the symbolic value of something? Not very. It happens occasionally, but not very often. So to fully enjoy the stories that we tell about who we are and why we are, we're going to need the capacity to hear them symbolically. And a true symbol, unlike a sign, for instance, a road sign that says stop or go, a true symbol is open to multiple plural interpretations. So we don't get stuck in our belief about what this symbol absolutely means. So you see that a lot if you work much with dreams. Any dream symbol can have multiple meanings. There's one that in particular that tends to resonate with the dreamer when we do the work of reflection and amplification and so on the dream itself. But multiple interpretations for each symbol is how it tends to work. And that's what makes theories of myth that literalize myths so boring. You know, myth is about solar deities. The myth is about the weather. It's a pre-scientific explanation. It's language codes. Even an archetypal approach suffers from that sometimes. You know, the earth images, nature images, that's the great mother. Well, what else is it? And I think this way of holding stories, namely beyond belief, and the myths in our fictions, and vice versa, and the voices, the deeper voices that come out of our stories, being able to perceive symbolically, all of this leads to a stance of acceptance and humility that in some ways can help guard us against self-righteousness and judgmentalism when people don't act the way we feel they should act. So growing up in a scandal-ridden Lutheran church, I would notice that on Sundays there would sometimes be these older folks of the church in the back, and they would be pointing at people who came in and muttering in these dark tones, you know, well, they haven't been here for a while. What are they doing here? And look what she's wearing and stuff like that, right? Today, the same psychology of self righteousness and persecution is on the lookout for the kind of car you drive, the fabric of the clothes you wear, and whether you always and unerringly get the pronouns right. As though we were some kind of judges and everybody else were accountable to us. And really, you could look at this as a holdover from patriarchal religious psychology. It's this whole dynamic between parents and children. And so we become parentified. We become everybody's dad or everybody's mom and pass judgment on everybody. And this really needs to go away. There will probably be always a little bit of that to live with. But it doesn't need to be so heavy-handed. It doesn't need to drive people out of the very groups we're trying to form. And I was listening on social media the other day to a video by a guy who was at one time a Christian evangelical, and then he moved to the West Coast and started hanging out more with lefties. And he said, wow, these people are more judgmental, the people he was hanging out with, not everybody, than the folks I left behind. And, he was making an earnest attempt to get it and to appreciate difference and to learn what people want and all that. And he was still getting pounded. So this is what happens when you have a doctrine or a dogma, especially when it doesn't identify itself as religious. And when it is religious, people just come out and say, where are you walking with Jesus now? And then judge you on that basis. Another thing, too, about this psychology is it makes certain people be your guru or your teacher or your authority figure. It's an apparent idealization. And so if they do anything to deviate from that, they get pounded. And people start muttering, they don't walk their talk. Well, who does? And we're not talking about flagrant abusive hypocrisy. We're just talking about people being ordinary human beings who make mistakes and sitting in judgment of them. So if we hold our stories more carefully and consciously, I think some of that at least goes away. Because there's no doctrine to stand up for and sell out to. So with some fluidity built into how we relate to our planetary mythology, or whatever term we want to call it by, perhaps we can have some fun with it. That's another thing about absolute belief, absolute literal belief. There isn't much fun in it usually. But what about having our stories focus more on performance, art, celebration, humor, having fun, holidays, rituals that are meaningful for us? What about that? All the major religions have rituals, and there's a good reason for that. We're ritualistic beings, just as perhaps we're religious beings. So knowing that, why don't we have some fun with them? In Catholic religious circles going way back, there used to be a ritual where somebody who was kind of an identified trickster or comic would make fun of everybody, in all the hierarchy, including the Pope. And it started to hit so close to home that they got rid of that ritual. Let's bring it back. For everybody, though. Let's leave out the hierarchy and bring back the ritual. How about that? Because our stories in the end should be a source of enjoyment, amusement, fulfillment, fun, relatedness, community, and a lot of other good things. We really don't stay on this planet very long. A span of decades, and that's it. And why not have some fun while we're here? It strikes me that in many mythologies, it's actually the trickster who creates the world. I think there's a hint there about what we're doing here. So if there ever is to be a planetary cycle of stories, perhaps the order of the day, which could begin right now, is to start telling stories that are fun to tell and that emphasize humaneness and inclusiveness, enjoyment and abundance, and appreciation for the beauty of the earth and the cosmos. Maybe that would be a good place to start our imagination running and see what comes with it and who speaks from it. Thanks.